Hi, Professor Olson, coming to you again from the home office. Sorry we couldn't be on campus together, but let's go over Chapter 5, the Roman Republic, together. Again, if you find I'm going too quickly because I'm going through the highlights, please check your documents and resource area. You will find the PowerPoints alone in that section. I've also posted the quiz and the discussion board for this week, for this unit. So let's dive in, shall we? All right, so the Roman Republic, I'm not sure how much you may have experienced from prior classes. I'm sorry if some of this is a repeat, but bear with me and, you'll also learn some new information. So, all right, so moving forward. The Romans, well, typically represent in popular culture today in many ways. Of course, we think of many things as uniquely Roman, gladiator games, for example, the legions. We think of the Colosseum. Colosseum is the anglicized version. We think of Circus Maximus, the chariot races. We think of augury and divination. We think of how concerned they were with the future, reading the future. The word janitor is actually from Janus, who was the god of the doorway. And of course, January, we have the two faces, one facing forward, one facing back. So, but let's look at the Romans more on their own terms, shall we? All right, now if you've seen maps, you know Italy is the boot in the world map. And of course, it is a peninsula. Even though it is such a small area that's had such a major impact on the world, it is, for all intents and purposes, a peninsula. And of course, the Mediterranean Sea is the main waterway. All right, the Apennines are steep, and of course, they do divide some of the territory, similar to the Greeks, who were, bound by their geography. But they have a lot of fertile farmland, a lot of rivers that are feeding that. Remember in Chapter 1, we spoke of the importance of rivers to human beings and their survival. All right, but let's talk about Rome's very humble beginnings, shall we? We know based on evidence that the ancient climate was colder, or cooler, I should say, and wetter, and there were more marshes at the time. And of course, over time, weather changed, things dried up, things changed. All right, but when we look at Rome, or as it was called by the Etruscans, Ruma, it was a trading post. It was a small little nothing place. People went there, they traded, they went on their way. And it's based on the Latium plain. And of course, you remember Sumer was also based on a plain. Now, the Latium plain gives rise to the word Latin, which of course is what the Romans will ultimately call themselves in their language. So if you've ever wondered why it's Latin, now you know. All right. So, and the best part is because the Tiber is inland, it's safe, it's a sheltered place, it's less likely to have people attacking it. So Rome was able to spread more peacefully because it had certain natural advantages. All right. Piracy was alive and well and very active in the ancient Mediterranean. All right. Later, Pompey will be able to clean out all the pirates from the Mediterranean. But for centuries, piracy was a big concern in the ancient world. All right. And being inland with the Tiber, Rome had a natural advantage. Rome was more peaceful. And to the north were the Etruscans, who we still don't know a lot about because unfortunately we cannot decipher their language. The few inscriptions we have left, we have no key to unlock them. While Napoleon's scholars would go to Egypt and find the so-called Rosetta Stone, which had Egyptian and Greek on it, which unlocked ancient Egyptian studies, we still haven't found that kind of key for the Etruscan language. We do know that the Etruscans and the Romans were intermarrying at first, and they had relationships, and they were doing trade. And then over time that changed, and they began to war with one another. Of course, we only have the Romans' word. We don't have the Etruscan side of the story. In addition, from trading with the Greeks and being exposed to first Greek and then later Hellenistic culture, some of that got absorbed into the Roman equation as well. All right. So when we think of Rome, what we have to remember is that where they were located, their geography, they were at a natural crossroads, being, of course, first a trading post and being an easy to defend area. So Rome had a number of natural advantages and also had access to other people groups, which helped influence them as well. All right. And remember, Rome is in the Latian plain. It spreads out bit by bit and takes over the entire peninsula. All right. And when we look at the Etruscans, again, we don't have an access, we don't have a key to their language. What we do know is this. There were a number of Etruscan cities. We know that there were a large percentage of Etruscans to the north. We know that they were ruled by kings. And that what we've been able to determine, there was more equality between the men and the women than would take place in Roman society. Romans would see their female relatives as property, first of their father, then of their husband. So we do know this much. We also know that their alphabet is much like the Phoenicians and the Greeks, because remember, the Phoenicians gave us consonants, the Greeks gave us vowels. All right. So we know there was an alphabet. We know that they had contact with the Phoenicians and the Greeks based on what we see in these inscriptions. They also were great bronze workers. They left behind some very beautiful artwork, and their bronze was valued by other cultures. All right. We do know, because competition for markets was sometimes fierce, that they did come into contact and sometimes conflict with Greek colonial settlements in Italy. All right. We also know that they introduced things that would become staples to the Romans' way of life. Olives, to of course make that electric light bulb of the ancient world, olive oil, which would of course go into lamps and be lit with wicks and would give light, as well as, of course, the Mediterranean diet to be eaten, to be consumed. And of course, the one big export Rome will give to the ancient world, grapes, which of course they'll turn into wine, and Roman wine was said to be the best in the ancient world. People would trade for it. In fact, some of the barbarian tribes would trade their prisoners of war as slaves just to get Roman wine. So this was really good wine. All right. So we do know that the Greeks influenced the Romans, the Etruscans influenced the Romans. So, and of course, unfortunately, though, for the Etruscans and the Greeks, there will be conflict with the Romans. All right. So these are just some things to think about as we look at the formation of Rome. All right. Now, if we think of the myths that go into Rome, we think of Romulus and Remus, these foundlings, these children who were abandoned, these twins who were abandoned and nursed by a she-wolf. There's some great ancient monuments showing them nursing with the wolf. And of course, Remus slew Romulus and named Rome in his honor. All right. We know later in the Republic, Virgil will give the Romans an origin myth by creating this work called the Aeneid, where Aeneas, this warrior from Troy, is fleeing the fallen city, and he's carrying his father, which symbolizes duty, on his back, and he's going out into the world, and he will eventually found Rome. The Romans had, shall we say, an inferiority complex. They felt that their culture wasn't as worthy, as exciting as the Greeks. So what they did was they actually gave themselves a little bit of a Greek origin story to tie themselves to what they saw as a more cultured group. All right. But again, these are myths. Every culture needs an origin myth. Even in America, we have origin myths. If you've ever heard the stories of Paul Bunyan, for example. So George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. Every culture has these. All right. Eventually, what happens, however, is the Etruscan kings become more powerful, and eventually they will take over Rome, which again is not a very big settlement yet. It's gone from trading post to settlement, it's starting to come into its own. And the Etruscan kings were said to rule much like tyrants, much like despots. So, what happens is the Romans will rise up against them and vow never, ever, ever to have a king. All right. And with this in mind, when they do establish their government, when we do see the Republic, we start off with two people in charge. And this is where Americans get their idea of checks and balances from. Two consuls. Both have the power of veto over the other, much like the American president can veto anything that crosses their desk that they don't like. I say they because maybe someday we will have a female president. So, but of course, Romans only had male consuls and male authority figures. All right. So when we look at this, the consuls each have the power of veto over the other. So this is a check and a balance. The consuls must be in agreement to get things done. Occasionally, however, when Rome found itself beset by enemies, they would make it so that there was only one consul in order to have all the decisions flow through him so that they could move quickly in a wartime footing. That consul is called a dictator. Now, when we hear the word dictator, we are immediately, thinking autocratic, Napoleon type figures. All right. But dictators during the Republic were supposed to have set term limits, usually 6 months. And of course, at the end of the 6 months, that would either be renewed again, depending on what the situation was, or if the crisis had passed, they would go back to their two consul system. All right. So, and as more and more Romans begin to come into the fold, more and more positions will be added. They'll have magistrates, they'll have praetors, they'll have aediles, they'll have so many different offices in order to deal with the bureaucracy and the administrative needs that are slowly forming. All right. Your mother would be proud if you became a consul, but where most of these consuls come from is actually a small office called the aedile, although it's not so small because they're in charge of the granaries, which kept grain flowing to the Roman population. They're also in charge of the gladiator games, which were a major morale booster and a way to keep people occupied. So these are positions to be stepping stones to get to be consul. All right. And of course, as more and more people come into the fold, because Rome is kind of like a shark. You know how they say if sharks don't keep swimming and eating and hunting, they die? It was similar for the Romans because as they started to leave the Latian plain, as they started to spread out, they had taken Etruscan cities. They had they had eliminated the Etruscans. And what they do is they keep bringing new people into the fold. And what they do is instead of asking them for tax money or forcing them to be subjugated, at first they're asking for people to give them their sons who are of military age or close to it in order to create an army. So they would give citizenship to these people. In return, the army kept cloning itself. They would bring new people into the fold, they would train them, they would spread out, they would get the next area and the next area. So in a way, they just keep replicating themselves and spread out across the peninsula. All right. And of course, as more people join, more people create more problems, more government, more administration. And most of the people fall into two groups, but the most numerous of these are the plebeians. These are the merchants, these are the poor, these are the soldiers. Most of them fall into the plebeian group. Patricians, on the other hand, are the rich. And of course, they're a smaller percentage of the population, but control more of the power. So the Centuriate Assembly was created to give a voice to these plebeians who had money, who had influence, and make it so that they could also join in. And of course, a lot of them were soldiers. So all of this gives the commoners increased political power. And of course, they demand more and more assemblies, more and more magistrates. So more and more government comes along to help solve these problems. All right. So more and more to think about for the Romans. All right. So moving along. All right, so again, patricians, these are the rich people. They're going to control a large amount of the wealth. And of course, as I tell so many of my students, land is wealth in the ancient world. It wasn't a matter always of having liquidity in terms of having gold or silver, coinage, and other movable goods, but land was seen as the ultimate arbiter of wealth. And of course, a lot of these patricians will go on to control more and more land, which we'll see the process in a little bit. The plebeians, however, are either newly made citizens, or their families have been here for a while and they've built up money via being merchants, engaging in commerce. And sometimes you could get ahead as a plebeian by agreeing to take a patrician who wanted to be your patron, much as we think of Patreon, the site for artists today and music makers and writers. These people, these patricians, would gift favors and money and whatever to their patron, to those they wanted to patronize. And in return, these plebeian clients would honor their patrons by voting the way they wanted them to vote in the political machine. All right. And of course, when we look at the family system, it doesn't matter if they're patrician or plebeian, there's a lot of similarities. Because this is a male-dominated society, the senior-most male is in charge, pater familias. Now, pater in Latin means father, so he's the father of the family. All right. And of course, they would be in charge. And they could even decide whether or not their sons were adults. You had to have your father agree to basically sign off on you being an adult. And of course, they were also in charge of who their daughters were going to marry. The paterfamilias had such power, he could even order the murder, if you will, of his family members or his slaves, because at first, during the Republic, the paterfamilias held absolute power over his household. This is not a position to be taken lightly. All right. And of course, these groups of families are organized into clans or tribes or gens. So you might have, say, 5 brothers, all of the same gens, who, of course, then have different branches of the family. And of course, until the father dies, when he's in charge, and then when he dies, probably the elder brother will become the paterfamilias over the entire gens. But again, still paterfamilias in their own households. All right. So, and of course, the plebeians got angry because they saw that power, not only in their own households, but even in society, now the patricians have all the power and all the wealth. All right. And eventually, there's more and more conflict, more and more dissatisfaction with the fact that the patricians hold most of the wealth and the power. All right. So just again, remember the paterfamilias is the male head of the family. All right. And at first, all of the Roman laws were conventions. They were traditions. It took a while for them to actually write down the laws, but the plebeians were demanding this. And eventually, the 12 tables would be the laws finally written down where everyone could see them and everybody could look at them and everybody could understand what was legal and what was not. All right, so the 12 tables finally codify the law. All right, so this was a big step forward. All right. Now again, remember what I said about being a shark. Rome has to keep moving or die. All right. And of course, its basic reward, which helped to get this expansion through so quickly, was by offering citizenship to those that they found to be worthy allies. Not everyone got citizenship. Some were not seen as worthy, but overall, most of those on the peninsula got citizenship. And of course, were then invested in understanding, Rome's goals and furthering those goals. And Rome institutionalized war. War was a religion. War was a religious rite. The god of war was very important for them. Generals and their troops would pray to the god of war, Mars, before going out into the field. All right. So this was part and parcel of both their identity, their expansion strategy, and of course, the national character and how events would be shaped. All right. So they dominate the Latian plain. They dominate over the Greek cities. They dominate over the Etruscans. And more, they are asking for soldiers so they can continue to replicate themselves, much like a cell. All right, you know how cells divide and spread out? Well, that's exactly what the Romans were doing. All right, and of course, this created new opportunities for wealth. Generals would allow their soldiers to plunder enemies who were not being offered citizenship. They had rules, certain rules and regulations to oversee who received how much of each bounty or booty or plunder. So all of this helps to bring more wealth into Rome. All right. So and of course, I want to talk more about Roman imperialism. All right. Rome fights so many wars. There's the Punic Wars. The Phoenicians were called Punics by the Romans. And if you remember, they created purple dye. They were the purple people. They had a strategy. They would spread out. They would talk to somebody and say, hey, we really like you and we're really happy to trade with you. Could we build a trading post here and continue to interact with you and continue to trade? So there was a whole network of Phoenicians spread out all over the Mediterranean into North Africa. The Romans saw them as a threat and as competition. So of course, over time, as Roman interests went against the Phoenicians' interests, 3 bloody wars would be fought. And the final one, the third one, would eliminate Carthage and basically end Phoenician power. All right. So just something to think about. So Carthage is destroyed. It's torn down. They salt the earth. All right. Even today, Sherman's March to the Sea in the Civil War, they salted and burned, and you can actually still see damages from where Sherman and his troops went through. All right, this was to make sure no one could use the land. Remember, land equals wealth, land equals resources. So this was a way to really show that the Phoenicians had been defeated. All right, so, and of course, there was a period where it looked like the Phoenicians might win, except it didn't go the way they had hoped. Hannibal embarks from North Africa, goes up and then down through the Alps with his elephants, hoping to win over allies on the Roman, on the Italian peninsula, and then defeat the Romans, or at least stop the Romans. Even today, they're still finding evidence of Hannibal's march through the Alps, because the Alps are great at preserving things. The climate up there is so perfect for preservation. They are actually finding people who died during World War I and World War II, and they're pretty preserved overall, all things considering. In fact, the oldest man, that we have, a really good example of, who was living in prehistoric times, Ötzi, was discovered in the Alps, just to give you an idea. All right. So, unfortunately, though, the Phoenicians failed. All right. And with that, and then with conquering Greek territories, the Romans were really expanding and really showing themselves to be the new world power and rising into that world power. And of course, they had different ways of dealing with their enemies. Some were offered citizenship, a lot of people were taken into slavery. But interestingly, Greek culture was influencing and infusing with the Romans. They all wanted Greek tutors for their children, for example. But overall, Roman imperialism is bloody. The Phoenicians are no more as a world power. The Greeks are now subjugated to Rome for the most part, and Rome is continuing to expand. All right. And remember that pyramid I mentioned at the beginning of the semester? The patricians are definitely on top. All right. And of course, slavery keeps expanding. Rome is a true slave state. And of course, as I've said earlier, anybody in the wrong place at the wrong time could become a slave in the ancient world. All right. And of course, the poorer people find themselves now competing with slaves for work. So unfortunately, this also takes a toll on any burgeoning middle class. All right. So more and more, there's becoming a stratification where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. All right. And a lot of the personalities that drive the empire, and at this point the republic, also play a part in why the state, the Roman state is moving out and taking certain territories. All right. Now, we need to talk about land and land reform. In an effort to make people happy, the generals would take their land and they would parcel it out to soldiers. As soldiers did their tour of duty and had service for 15, 20, 25 years, they were eligible to retire with a farm. Farming was considered the ideal in the Roman culture. So all of these soldiers would retire, they get their land, they would have their family, and they would be farming. Unfortunately, though, sometimes the crops didn't always work out, and we're going to see how this is going to play a part later in the Roman economy. All right. So if you think back to your American history, you remember the plantation system. A small group of free people, a large number of slaves farming the land, doing all of the chores. In a way, that's what happens with the Romans, but it happens in a way that shunts the poorer people and the middle class out into the cold. All right, at first, the soldiers all received their parcels of land, or people could buy parcels of land depending on if they were offered for sale, and people had their farms. They also have public lands where people could go to gather firewood if they found dead sticks, for example, or they could, use them to run some of their sheep or cows through. There might be an area near the town that would be helpful for people. They could gather there and pick up things they needed, such as, the wood, or, letting the animals graze. But what happened was the laws changed to benefit the rich. More and more rich people began buying up these public lands, making it so that more and more poorer people could not have access to them. Now, unfortunately, remember what I said about sometimes your harvest doesn't come through? There's drought, there's bad conditions. More and more of these soldiers turned farmers couldn't have their farms, and they couldn't find other work because they were competing against slaves. In fact, there was legislation that was proposed to mark the slaves out in certain ways, but it was quashed because it was feared that if the slaves realized how numerous they were going to rise up and rebel. So a lot of these men were forced to sell their land to richer people. So let's say you are a rich person and you buy up 6 farms next to each other. Well, now you have one big farm. And this is latifundia. Latifundia are like the plantation system of the American South. Huge farms. Now, most people, when they bought a farm in the ancient world, were looking to do subsistence farming. They were looking to grow what they needed to survive, maybe have a surplus they could trade with other people, maybe make some things out of some of the resources they had to bring to market and sell. But overall, a subsistence farming model is pretty much for you, your immediate family, and maybe your community. Now, with these latifundia, the rich people have now created commercial farms where they can grow crops that require a lot of land. First off, of course, are oil, the olive oil. So they need olive groves. And olive groves, of course, take up a lot of time and a lot of room. It takes years to get an olive tree to maturity. But they have the ability to do this because they have the money available to invest. They're not like our smaller farmers who are living very, very much in a contained hand-to-mouth situation. They can invest the time and the energy and wait. They're also growing vineyards or growing grapes. Again, another thing that requires time, effort, and money. And the final cash crop that they are using these latifundia to create are, no, it's not entirely a cash crop, it's actually on the hoof. Sheep for wool. And sheep require a lot of land because sheep, when they graze, let's say this is the ground and this is your grass, they don't just eat the grass. They're actually dipping into the ground and creating divots, and then you have to wait for things to grow back. So you need a large area to run your sheep. So these latifundia spring up, and they have the big cash crops. Once those things come into maturity, they have oil, they have wine, they have wool, and they can sell them for a big profit. So where do all these small farmers go who have lost their land? They pack up their families and they go to Rome, hoping to find work. Rome becomes flooded. At its height, Rome will have 1 million people living in it. And they're all out looking for work. If they're really lucky, they might get a job working as a dock worker one day. They might work as a farmhand the next for some bigger place, but that's probably not likely because they're probably going to have slaves. So they're really living hand to mouth. And remember the Edil I mentioned earlier who's in charge of the granary? Well, this is going to become the first welfare state. They're actually going to hand out daily rations of grain to poor people who are willing to wait in line. In fact, the term bread and circuses comes from this model of the welfare state. They get the grain to make their bread, so they have enough to survive, and then to divert them and keep them from rebelling and creating havoc, they're offered games, they're offered gladiator games and chariot races to keep them entertained, to keep them from rebelling. All right. So again, a lot of people are flocking to the city. In the meantime, because the latifundia needs so many resources to keep going, a lot of the slave population that's in Rome is actually working in those back-breaking jobs out on the latifundia. All right, so just some things to keep in mind. All right, so, and Rome becomes bigger. Rome needs so many resources that it's going to eventually create concrete in order to make buildings faster. And ironically, Roman concrete's better than ours. It's now stood for about 2,000 years. Ours is starting to break down, people have noticed, in like a century or two. And they think the reason for that is the Romans used seawater rather than fresh water. Fun fact. All right. So, and believe me, they have to build. Remember that bread and circuses model? They've got to build things like amphitheaters for people to go see plays and games. And of course, the Colosseum will be the, prime example of that. But a lot of your Roman provinces would have mini models of Rome the way they're laid out. And that'll include amphitheaters and that'll include public baths. All right. The town of Bath in England, for example, is named for baths. All right. There's a beautiful example of a Roman bath still there. Still can be seen today. All right. And of course, the so-called insulae, the tenement buildings, some of them will have some concrete as well. but they're pretty flimsy, and a lot of them are done on the cheap, and they go up and smoke very quickly because people have very little furniture. They're living with braziers and candles. They're sitting on piles of clothing or cloth. Maybe they have a stool, maybe they have a chair. All right. So Rome is not a very happy place. You're either really rich or really poor. It was said that good Romans did not go out at night because of fear of being robbed or killed. If they did go out, the rich, they have bodyguards with them in order to avoid having any problems. All right. So just some things to think about. When we look at Roman religion, I mentioned how they've institutionalized warfare. Mars is a major god for them. All right. They also adopted practices from the Etruscans, reading sheep's entrails. They were worried about the future. They would look up at the birds in the sky, and if certain patterns emerged, that could be good or bad luck. They had festivals. They had little household gods that they had had with them before they took over the more Greek model. Hestia, the goddess of the fireplace. Vesta, the goddess of the fire. In fact, the Vestal Virgins, who will become a major part of Roman daily life, are drawn from that belief of Vesta. And they had to keep the eternal flame going. If they didn't, they could be executed. All right. So just some things to think about. Now, I don't know if you remember, but I mentioned earlier we spoke of Stoicism. They believe in an afterlife. They believe in public duty. They believe in individual virtue. Every life has suffering. How do you deal with it? How do you learn from it? Stoicism becomes increasingly popular during the Republic. And of course will go on to be popular in the Empire, and even through the ancient world to medieval Europe. All right, just some things to think about. Citizens were the only ones, of course, who could engage in public life, but, political public life. But some people who embraced Stoicism were not public figures, but they still believed that they had a duty to themselves and those around them. All right. So just some things to think about. We also can talk about syncretism. It was believed all gods were similar. Helios, the god of the sun, and Apollo, the god of the sun, are basically the same god. All right, so a lot of syncretism, a lot of beliefs that were coming together. All right, and of course, when we speak about culture, we have to speak about how the Greeks, of course, synthesized. All right. Oh, I'd forgotten to mention one thing. Let me double back to the Latifundia for a moment. When we talk about the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius Gracchus, for example, and his brother Gaius, they actually proposed to end the Latifundia and return that land to the farmers. Their proposals were, of course, denied, and it actually created greater unrest and mob rule. So it was really important to find ways to distract people. Again, the bread and circuses. All right. So culture. A lot of people are going to the baths. They're going to plays. In fact, a lot of men did business at the Roman baths. You could be there all day playing games. You could be playing Lat, a version of chess. You could be playing, political games too. You could actually meet with some of the people that you were supporting with. All right. You could go to the gymnasium. So there were many, many ways for people to connect. All right. And of course, lots of people went to plays. If you remember, I mentioned the New Comedy. That Greek model carried over into the Roman Republic. So a lot of people like comedy over tragedy. All right. And of course, the Greek culture now influences the Roman culture. They begin a system of public education. Usually tutors would meet in marketplaces, and they would tutor boys, and they would teach them rhetoric. They would teach them to get them ready for public office. All right. A lot of lawyers begin to spring up out of this too, people who could help to advise others. All right. Most of their literature, again, comedy, satire. They loved the Greek comedies. All right. They were very conservative. They didn't like the new Greek ways. They felt that the ancient Greek, the classical Greek, were fine, but they weren't so big on some of the more new schools of thought, the philosophy, the comedy. They really wanted to keep it, shall we say, conservative. And of course, when we say conservative, we don't mean our political system. We just mean they were very, very slow to accept certain changes. All right, just keeping that in mind. All right, and of course, trade and agriculture continues to grow. All right, and now we run into a real problem. Now we begin to see personalities shaping the republic. All right, and I want to address that because that's really the crux of where the empire or the republic is going to collapse and where we're going to start to see changes. All right, unfortunately, I don't think, yeah, they don't have him here. All right, let's speak of a guy named Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius is consul a number of times, all right, and the Gracchi brothers' failed reforms created a lot of ill will and a lot of mob rule that had to be quashed, all right, would-be mob rulers were quashed. And a lot of people who were homeless because, or close to it, because they had lost their farms and come to the cities, couldn't find work, all these malcontents, Gaius Marius recruited a number of them for the army. And originally, as a soldier, your loyalty oath was sworn to Rome. Gaius Marius changed all that. He had them swear it directly to him and promised if they followed him, he would get them land at the end of their tour. All right, so the soldiers are dependent on the generals, and the generals take full advantage of this. After Gaius Marius, Sulla, his one rival, who was younger than him and a fiery redhead, he also had his soldiers swear allegiance only to him. All right, and of course, Gaius and Marius and Cornelius Sulla are going to have open warfare between them because they each have their own army. All right, and this, of course, is very, very dangerous for the Republic. All right, and in fact, this loyalty oath being sworn only to Marius, and then as other generals seize on the same model, will be the beginning of the end for the Republic because the military men will be taking control. All right, and of course, one of those military men is a man named Julius Caesar, who I'm sure you've all heard of. All right, Julius Caesar spent a lot of time in the army. He was, commander. So he's in Spain, and then they send him to Gaul, which we would say today is modern day France. His Gallic Wars, missives to the people back home in Rome about his bravery and his actions during the Gallic Wars, will help to give him a wonderful public relations campaign. So when he comes back to Rome, everybody is thinking he's a great general, he's a wonderful guy, and of course, with this in mind, he is able to use his popularity in order to move into political power. All right, and Pompey, remember I mentioned him earlier, who helped clean out the pirates from the Mediterranean. Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Crassus formed the first triumvirate. Triumvirate, of course, is tri, is three, vir is man from Latin. So this three-man group come together and decide they are going to control as much of the Republic as possible. But when Caesar doesn't get his way and crosses the Rubicon River and disobeys the Senate, he's showing several things. One, he's not afraid to break a taboo because you never were supposed to march on Rome. Two, that the Senate is not the powerful group that it thinks it is, and that its power is actually waning. And we're going to see that continues throughout the last of the Republic and into the Empire. The Senate becomes nothing more than a mouthpiece. So all of that is going to happen with this. All right. And of course, the crises continue, the divides continue, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. All right. And in fact, we need to talk about Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra, the seventh of her name, was a direct descendant of Ptolemy, who you might remember was the man who took over Egypt and created the so-called Ptolemaic kingdom. All right. And with this in mind, Ptolemy and his descendants, for the most part, never learned to speak Egyptian. However, Cleopatra did. All right. She has an affair with Caesar, has children with Caesar, at least one we know of, Caesarion. And then after Caesar is too caught up with things in Rome to pay as much attention to her, she takes up with Mark Antony. And of course, because Antony's spending so much time with a foreign queen and has military experience and followers, the Romans worry that Antony is going to ally himself with Egypt and have Cleopatra help him start an invasion and take over Rome. So the Romans decide that will never stand, and they decide to, of course, invade Egypt. And of course, Egypt will fall and become a major breadbasket for Rome and for the bread and circuses. So with that in mind, during the Battle of Actium, this is actually going to signal Pompey's defeat, because Pompey actually rebels to some extent, and it also signals the end of Antony's power. Now, Antony had one job which he did not do well. Caesar dies. Octavian, who he's adopted as his son, who's also his nephew or grandnephew or stepnephew, Antony's supposed to execute the will and give Octavian what he is supposed to get as the heir to Caesar. Unfortunately, Antony does not discharge his duty, which really annoys Octavian. And in fact, Octavian, believe it or not, one of Caesar's requests was for, I think it was 150 pairs of gladiators to be exhibited for his funeral games. Octavian has to pay for this out of his pocket. But his ties to his adopted father and his armies come in handy, because then Octavian can use his military power in order to eventually gain control of Rome. All right. He manages to defeat Mark Antony's forces, and now the Republic has officially, even though it doesn't know it yet, come to an end. All right. When Caesar was assassinated by his peers, when he, was stabbed, it was because they believed he was trying to become a king. But he wasn't. He really thought he was doing the best for Rome. Just as when Sulla assumed control over Rome as a dictator, he also thought he was doing the best for Rome. But Sulla killed off his enemies. Caesar was merciful and let them live, and of course they turned on him. Now, having said this, what happens is Octavian begins a slow, sensitive reordering of the Roman world. While he never actually takes the title of emperor, for our purposes as historians, Octavian, who's given the title of Augustus, or Great One, by the Senate, and that becomes his new name, Augustus, formerly known as Octavian, now will, in everything but name, with that reordering, become the first emperor of Rome. This will be the fall of the Roman Republic and the beginning, even though he doesn't call himself emperor, of the Roman Empire. All right. So just some quick overview here. As you can see, ancient Italy was home originally to several different people. In fact, some of these become classes of gladiators as they're defeated. This is a way to show the power Rome has over them still. Samnites, for example, will be a popular class. All right. And of course, again, this is all we have of the Etruscans. We have their art, we have inscriptions, which we still sadly cannot read. And in fact, the gladiator games were actually based out of Etruscan funeral games. So that was another way that Etruria, or the Etruscans, gave to the Romans. Romans took those things into itself. They subsumed them. All right. In the words of any real estate agent, location, location, location. Rome is based on 7 hills. A lot of the neighborhoods aren't that good. The place you really wanted to be was here. This is where all the business was conducted. The Forum, for example, was the place where business was done. Capitoline Hill, because, of course, this is where the temple to Jupiter sits. All right. So these are where you want it to be. You want it to be right around here. Via Sacra, the Sacred Way. All right, Via Appia, of course, the Appian Way is going to be one of the major roads. All roads lead to Rome. You've probably heard that. Even today, Roman roads were so well engineered. We still have pieces of them in and around Italy. All right. The lictors, who, of course, were important, but I want to look at the map. Notice how many roads now are connecting the peninsula. Roman roads were originally built by soldiers. Everywhere they went, they would start installing roads. It was also a way to keep the men busy and out of trouble. And eventually, of course, as more and more slaves begin to become part of the Roman society, a lot of that work will begin to fall to slaves. But it was said Appius, the man who helped build the Appian Way, went blind during the building of it. He used to walk barefoot on the stones to make sure everything was straight. So it was a lot of work, a very big feat of engineering. All right, and of course the Roman legions. All right, as you can see, they have big shields. All right, later they're going to have the gladius, a stabbing weapon that will be well balanced, easy to handle. But at first, they're much like the Greeks. They start out with the javelins, and then they get the Pugio dagger, which is a wide dagger. Again, like the gladius, good for thrusting and stabbing. And of course, they're hiding behind their shields, and phalanxes are turtles, much like the hoplites in ancient Greece. Here, of course, is a piece of one of the Roman roads. Here's wagon tracks, because of course, wagons always left holes and ruts in the dirt. All right, as you can see, Rome is expanding. At its height, Rome will be huge. Much as Alexander united a large area, Rome will do the same thing. All right, so just some things to think about. All right, and of course Zeus, as you can really see the influence of the Greeks. All right, and of course their artwork is moving more and more toward realism. If you get a chance, you can probably find examples online. You can look at some of the frescoes. The Romans were big on art in their home. They would have the walls painted with frescoes. They would have small, tiny tiles, mosaics for the floors. Some bedrooms also have mosaics on the wall. All right, and of course, Pompeii. There was a great exhibit, Discovery Times Square, which sadly is closed right now, had done an exhibit of the Pompeii with some of the castings that were done. Very riveting stuff. If you get a chance, maybe you can find some images online. All right, Cicero. I know we say Cicero because we've anglicized everything with the hard C's, but it was actually Cicero in the day. Marcus Tullius Cicero was actually a major rhetorician, and he laid the groundwork for a lot of modern day rhetoric, how to make speeches, how to effectively convince an audience to your point of view. All right, and of course Julius Caesar. By the way, if you've ever wondered about his name, Caesar was actually a nickname, and it means curly head because he had curly hair. So next time you order a Caesar salad, just wanted you to have that thought, curly head. And of course, again, if we were saying it in the Latin, it would be Julius Caesar, which of course is where the Greek or the Germans get their word Kaiser for king from. So Julius Caesar, curly head. And by the way, his first name was Gaius, which was pretty much like Joe in modern English. Just thought you'd like to know that too. All right, so as you can see, the Roman Empire continues to increase. North Africa, Spain becomes another breadbasket like Egypt because there's a lot of people to feed. Remember, Rome at its height had 1 million people there. Not all of them were rich. All right, so just some things to think about. All right, so on that note, I hope you found this helpful. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Office hours to Tuesday and Thursday, 3 to 4. If that doesn't work, email me. We can set up a time. And all I can say is have a great day. All right, take care. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking this out.